welcome to Infinite History Stories. Beneath today's oceans, there may be forgotten coastlines where humans once walked, hunted, built fires, and watched the world they knew slowly disappear. Around 11,600 years ago, the Ice Age ended, the climate shifted, glaciers melted, and the seas began to rise, drowning ancient landscapes before history could write their names. This was not one simple flood, but a chain of rising waters, collapsing ice, lost homelands, and memories that may still echo inside humanity's oldest flood myths. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of ancient mystery and forgotten history you enjoy, then stay with me because the story of the Great Flood may be the story of how the modern human world began. The shoreline does not vanish all at once. It retreats in the dark, grain by grain, tide by tide, as if the world itself is breathing in and refusing to breathe out again. A family that once sleeps above a wide plain of reeds and saltgrass wakes generation after generation to find the sea a little closer. The old path to the shellbeds is gone beneath shallow water. The place where children once followed animal tracks across damp sand is now a earring inlet. Farther inland, the river that used to move slowly through the valley begins to swell with unfamiliar strength, carrying uprooted trees, broken ice, and the cold memory of mountains dissolving somewhere beyond the horizon. No one standing there can know that they're living through one of the great turning points in human history. To them, it is not the end of the Ice Age. It is weather, hunger, migration, fear, opportunity, and the strange feeling that places remembered by the old are becoming impossible to reach. Around 11,600 years ago, the world enters a new rhythm. The long Ice Age, which has shaped landscapes, animals, and human movement for tens of thousands of years, is giving way to the warmer conditions of the Holocene. The transition is not gentle. It is uneven, unstable, and deeply local. Ice sheets that once smothered the northern continents are shrinking. Glaciers are pulling back into valleys and highlands. Meltwater is gathering in lakes as large as inland seas. Rivers are changing course. Coastlines are being redrawn faster than memory can settle. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery are you enjoying. Because the story of this ancient flood is not only about water. It is about the moment when the map of the human world begins to disappear beneath it. The phrase Great Flood can mislead if it is taken too literally. There is no need to imagine a single wave covering every mountain, no single storm swallowing the planet in one impossible night. What the evidence suggests is stranger and in some ways more haunting. Across centuries and millennia, different human groups witness different catastrophes: rising seas, drowned plains, collapsing ice dams, glacial lake outbursts, violent river floods, storm surges moving across newly flooded coasts, and familiar territories turning into islands or seabeds. No single explanation fully accounts for every later flood story, every drowned landscape, or every buried memory. But the world at the end of the Ice Age is a world where water repeatedly breaks the boundaries people trust. For Ice Age humans, coastlines are not empty edges of the map. They are among the richest places to live. Shores offer fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals, driftwood, edible plants, fresh water near estuaries, and easy travel along beaches and river mouths. A coast is a road, a pantry, a meeting place, and sometimes a refuge. Yet those same coasts are the most vulnerable to the rising sea. Much of what humans built there is made from wood, hide, bone, fiber, and packed earth. Much of it leaves little trace even under ideal conditions. When the sea comes, it does not simply cover villages and camps. It grinds them, scatters them, buries them under silt, or leaves them far offshore where archaeologists can barely reach. The evidence remains incomplete, not because nothing happened there, but because the best places to live were often the first places to be erased. The scale is difficult to feel from numbers alone. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets are at their greatest extent, so much water is locked in ice that global sea levels are far lower than today. Vast areas now underwater are dry land. Continental shelves stretch outward as open plains. Rivers cut across landscapes that modern people would only know as seafloor. Islands are connected to mainlands. Coastlines lie far beyond their present positions. Then, as the climate warms and ice melts, the ocean begins its long climb. It does not rise at one steady speed. At times it moves slowly enough for communities to adapt. At other times, meltwater pulses accelerate the change and the sea advances with unnerving speed on the scale of human generations. A place can be safe in the stories of grandparents and dangerous in the lives of grandchildren. Imagine a camp on a low coastal plain. It has no stone walls, no written records, no monuments meant to last for 12,000 years. It has hearths, tools, fish bones, shell piles, footprints, perhaps posts driven into damp ground, perhaps a pattern of repeated return because the place is good and people know it. The elders understand the tides. They know where the freshwater pools are after rain. They know which inlets hold fish when the season turns. Then the balance changes. Salt creeps into fresh water. Storms push farther inland. The beach moves. The marsh drowns. A burial place near the old dunes becomes unreachable. People do what humans have always done. They adjust, argue, remember, return, give up, move on. What survives in the records suggests adaptation, but adaptation is not the same as comfort. A migrating shoreline can take away not only food, but belonging. At the same time, inland worlds are also becoming unpredictable. To the north, huge bodies of meltwater build along the edges of shrinking ice sheets. Some are held back by ice dams, natural barriers of frozen mass that appear solid until they fail. When they break, the released water can roar across the land with a force almost beyond imagination, carving channels, stripping soil, moving boulders, and transforming valleys in days or weeks. These events are not global floods, but for anyone close enough, they are total. The known world can be rewritten before a single lifetime has time to understand it. Scholars still debate the timing, scale, and effects of many ancient meltwater events, but the broader pattern is clear. Glaciation turns water into an agent of sudden change. This is why the date 11,600 years ago carries such weight. It stands near the close of the Younger Dryas, a sharp return to colder conditions that interrupts the general warming after the Ice Age. Then, as that cold phase ends, the climate shifts again. Temperatures rise, ecosystems reorganize. Ice continues to retreat. Sea levels continue their climb. In many places, the old Ice Age world does not slowly fade like evening light. It fractures. Earths move differently or vanish from familiar routes. Plant communities change. Rivers become unreliable. Wetlands appear where dry ground once stretched. Dry ground appears where old water systems fail. For people living through it, the transformation is not abstract climate history. It is the question of where to camp, what to eat, which direction to walk, and whether ancestral knowledge still points to survival. The human beings in this story are not passive victims waiting for disaster. They are skilled observers, hunters, gatherers, fishers, toolmakers, navigators, and keepers of memory. They read tracks in mud, bird movement in the sky, the taste of water, the timing of plants, the behavior of animals before storms. Their lives depend on noticing small changes before those changes become fatal. That may be one of the lesser-known truths of the post-Ice Age world. Survival is not only physical strength or luck, it is attention. A people who can recognize that a river is behaving differently, that a shoreline is no longer stable, that a herd has shifted its path, may survive where others do not. Yet even the most attentive communities can be overwhelmed when the landscape itself stops keeping its old promises. There is a deep irony here. The same warming that helps open the way toward the settled worlds of the Holocene also destroys many of the worlds that came before. The end of the Ice Age creates new forests, new wetlands, new coastlines, new abundance in some regions, and new pressures in others. It makes certain forms of human life more possible while making older patterns harder to maintain. In the long view, this is the dawn of the climate background in which farming, villages, monuments, and written history will eventually appear. But in the lived moment, it may look less like a dawn than a loss. The path is gone, the hunting ground is gone, the old coast is gone. The sea has taken it, and with it perhaps stories that no later civilization will ever recover. So the Great Flood 11,600 years ago is best approached not as one event but as a threshold. On one side is the late Ice Age world, colder, broader with lower seas and landscapes now vanished. On the other side is the Holocene world, warmer, wetter in some places, drier in others, with coastlines closer to those we recognize today. Between them is a long turbulence of melting ice, rising water, rock, and lakes, shifting weather, and human memory under pressure. The mystery is not simply whether ancient peoples saw floods. They did. The deeper mystery is how many worlds were drowned before anyone could write their names, and how much of what later peoples called myth began as the memory of real ground disappearing beneath real water. The cold returns like a warning that the Ice Age is not finished with the world yet. After thousands of years of gradual warming, after forests begin to push into old open lands and animals start to follow new routes across a changing map, the climate suddenly turns backward. The air sharpens, winters lengthen. In some regions, young trees that had begun to claim the land retreat again before tundra grasses, shrubs and bare wind. Lakes hold water. Glaciers pause their withdrawal or advance in certain mountain valleys. For people living through it, the change does not arrive as a scientific event with the name. It arrives as harder seasons, altered herds, unfamiliar scarcity, and a sense that the world is capable of reversing itself. This reversal is now known as the Younger Dryas, a cold interval that begins around 12,900 years ago and ends around 11,600 years ago. It is one of the most important climatic interruptions at the close of the last ice age because it breaks the simple story of a planet slowly warming into the Holocene. The warming does not move in a straight line. It stutters, it surges, it collapses back into cold, then leaps forward again. The Younger Dryas is not equally severe everywhere, and scholars still debate the precise mechanisms that triggered and ended it. But the broad outline is clear just when the late Ice Age world seems to be loosening. Something disrupts the climate system and pulls large parts of the northern hemisphere back toward glacial conditions. The name itself comes from a small Arctic alpine flower Dryas octopetilla whose fossil pollen and plant remains appear in sediments from cold environments. It is a quiet name for a violent climatic pause in layers of lake mud and peat in pollen records in ice cores and in the chemistry of ancient shells. Researchers can see signs that landscapes changed abruptly. Trees give way to open vegetation in some regions. Dust patterns shift. Temperature indicators fall. The world does not become a full return to the deepest ice age, but it becomes cold enough, and unstable enough to matter deeply. For human communities, even a regional shift in growing seasons, animal movement, snow cover, and river behavior can change everything. One of the striking things about the Younger Dryas is its speed. Climate change in deep time is often imagined as something so slow that no single generation can truly feel it. Yet parts of the Younger Dust transition appear to have unfolded quickly enough to enter human experience. The evidence remains incomplete and different archives preserve different rhythms, but ice core records suggest that some temperature shifts around this period may have occurred over decades rather than many centuries. Decades are not abstract. Decades are grandparents remembering a milder youth while children grow up in a colder world. Decades are the span between a reliable hunting valley and a place where the animals no longer come at the right time. Decades are long enough for memory to compare and short enough for fear to notice. The leading mainstream explanation connects the Younger Dust to the behavior of meltwater and ocean circulation. As the great ice sheets melt, huge volumes of fresh water enter the North Atlantic system. Fresh water is lighter than salty ocean water, and when enough of it spreads across key regions, it can interfere with the sinking of dense water that helps drive major ocean currents. These currents move heat around the planet if they weaken or reorganize. The climate of surrounding regions can shift dramatically. In simple terms, the melting of ice may have helped create a temporary return to cold by disrupting the ocean's heat engine. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, and the exact routing, timing, and volume of meltwater remain debated. But this ocean circulation framework remains central to mainstream scientific understanding. There are more dramatic proposals, too. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that fragments of a comet or other cosmic debris may have struck or exploded over parts of Earth, helping trigger fires, extinctions, and climatic disruption. It has attracted public attention because it offers a single catastrophic spark at a moment already loaded with mystery. But it remains disputed, and is not accepted as the settled explanation by mainstream science. The problem is not that impacts never happen. Earth's history proves they do. The problem is evidence. A claim of this scale requires clear, consistent, direct traces across the relevant sites and layers, and researchers continue to disagree over whether the proposed markers truly demonstrate an impact event. For this story, the important point is not to turn uncertainty into spectacle. It is to recognize that the Younger Dryas sits at the intersection of real climate upheaval and powerful human imagination. For people near the great ice sheets, the cold is only part of the danger. Ice is not still. Even when it seems frozen and eternal, it is storing pressure, water, and future violence. Along the ice margins, meltwater pools into vast lakes. Some drain gradually, others wait behind unstable barriers. A world locked in cold can still be full of water searching for release. The Younger Dryas may have slowed some melting in some regions, but it did not restore the old world permanently. It delayed the inevitable. It held the door partly closed while pressure built on the other side. When the cold interval ends, the warming that follows is not merely a soft transition into a pleasant climate. It is the release of a system already loaded with ice, water, and stability. This is why the end of the Younger Dryas around 11,600 years ago feels so decisive. It marks the beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch in which all known written history, cities, states, agriculture, and modern civilization eventually unfold. But the boundary is not important only because of what comes later. It matters because it signals a climate shift that changes the possibilities of human life. Warmer conditions allow forests to expand, coastlines to continue moving, wetlands to form, and new ecological zones to stabilize. At the same time, warming accelerates the melting of remaining ice and contributes to rising seas. The world becomes more livable in some ways and more dangerous in others. A stable climate is not born in a single peaceful morning. It emerges from the wreckage of older patterns. The people living through this do not know they stand at the threshold of the Holocene. They know only that familiar signs are becoming unreliable. A valley once too cold for certain trees may begin to change. A river once fed by predictable seasonal melt may grow erratic. Animals adapted to open steppe may retreat, decline, or follow shrinking habitats northward. Other species move in. Fish, birds, deer, wild cattle, boar, and plant foods become more important in some regions. The broad human response is not one invention, but many local adjustments. Some groups follow herds, some intensify fishing, some return more often to rich wetlands, some experiment with managing plants long before farming becomes fully established. What survives in the records suggests flexibility, but also pressure. Climate does not command human behavior like a ruler giving orders. It changes the board on which choices are made. A lesser-known detail is that the end of the Younger Dryas is not simply a story of ice melting in the far north. It is also a story written in sediments far from glaciers, in tropical corals, cave formations, lake basins, pollen grains, and drowned river valleys. The whole Earth does not respond in the same way at the same moment, but the climate system is connected enough that a disturbance in one region can leave fingerprints elsewhere. Corals can record changing sea level. Speleothems in caves can preserve shifts in rainfall. Lake mud can reveal changing vegetation and erosion. Ancient shorelines can show where water once stood. The green at flood is not found in one dramatic layer everywhere on Earth. It is reconstructed from many quiet witnesses. In human terms, the Younger Dryas may have acted like the last cold breath of the Ice Age before the world changed shape for good. It preserved for a little longer some of the ecological tensions of the late glacial world. It held back the full arrival of the warmer Holocene. Then, when it ended, the consequences unfolded across landscapes already stressed and rearranged. The sea would keep rising. Meltwater would keep moving. Coasts would keep retreating. Ancient people would continue to adapt, migrate, remember, and lose places they once knew. The cold snap itself was not the flood, but it helped set the stage for why the waters that followed mattered so much. The world had been paused at the edge of transformation, and then the pause broke. When the cold finally loosens its grip, the planet does not simply warm. It begins to leak. Ice that has survived for ages starts to soften at its edges, fracture along hidden lines, and surrender water into every hollow that can hold it. Across the northern world, glaciers pull back from valleys they once filled wall to wall. Ice sheet ETs that had pressed down on continents like enormous white kingdoms begin to thin. Their surfaces darken with dust, ash, melt pools, and summer sunlight. At their margins, streams appear first as silver threads, then as braided torrents. The water runs over gravel, beneath ice, through tunnels, into basins, into rivers, into lakes that swell against unstable natural dams. The thaw is not a quiet rescue from winter. It is a reawakening of forces that have been locked away under ice. To understand why this matters so deeply, the scale of the vanished ice has to be felt. During the height of the last ice age, immense ice sheets cover much of Canada, parts of the northern United States, northern Europe, and other high-latitude regions. Mountain glaciers occupy valleys far beyond their modern limits. So much water is stored on land as ice that the sea is far lower than it is today. The world's coastlines displaced outward, exposing continental shelves and connecting lands that later generations will know only as islands. But this frozen arrangement is temporary. As the climate warms after the last glacial maximum, the ice sheets begin a long retreat, and every meter of melting ice has to go somewhere. Some of it enters the ocean gradually, some gather into lakes, some moves through rivers, some waits behind barriers until the day those barriers fail. In North America, the shrinking ice creates enormous meltwater systems along the southern margins of the Laurentide ice sheet. Lakes form where ice blocks old drainage routes, water pools against frozen walls. The map becomes unstable because the ice itself is part of the plumbing. A lake may drain south for a time, then east, then north, depending on which passage opens and which ice margin collapses. This is one of the stranger details of delaciation. Rivers are not always permanent features in a melting world. They can be temporary decisions made by ice. A route that carries water for centuries may suddenly be abandoned when a new outlet opens. A quiet basin may become a flood path. A valley may inherit the violence of water gathered across a continent. The same kind of transformation occurs in different forms across Eurasia. Ice retreats from Scandinavia and the British Isles. Glaciers shrink in the Alps and other mountain ranges. Permafrost landscapes begin to soften. Rivers carry heavy sediment from freshly exposed, oast ground. The land itself is raw, recently uncovered and easily eroded, where ice has scraped soil away. Plants must recolonize from scattered refuges, where meltwater spreads, wetlands and lakes appear, where channels deepen. Rivers cut into loose glacial deposits. A newly thawed landscape is not automatically fertile, nor is it instantly stable. It is a world in transition, full of mud, gravel, cold lakes, shifting banks, drowned hollows, and open surfaces waiting for life to return. For people moving through such places, water is both promise and threat. Meltwater rivers can attract animals. Lake edges can become rich hunting and gathering grounds. Wetlands bring birds, fish, reeds, edible roots, and seasonal abundance. Newly exposed land may open routes into territories that were once buried under ice. But the same water can also destroy a camp, isolate a group, or make old pathways impossible. A river swollen by glacial melt is not like a familiar stream after rain. It carries the power of distant ice. It can rise in seasons when people do not expect it. It can shift channels across loose ground. It can undercut banks and turn safe crossings into traps. What survives in the record suggests that late Ice Age and early Holocene humans were extraordinarily adaptable. Yet even adaptable people must learn the rules of a landscape before the landscape changes them again. The thaw also changes the weight of the world. Ice sheets are not only frozen water, they are mass. They press the crust downward. As they melt, the land slowly rebounds, rising in a process that continues long after the ice disappears. This rebound alters coastlines, river gradients, and local sea levels. In some places, land rising after ice melt can counter the sea's advance. In others, the ocean overwhelms low ground before rebound can save it. This means the story of rising water is never identical everywhere. A shoreline may retreat rapidly in one region while remaining more complex in another. Scholars still debate the timing and local impact of many post-glacial sea level changes because coastlines are shaped by a combination of global ocean rise, land movement, sediment supply, storms, and regional geology. The evidence remains incomplete, especially where the most important traces now lie underwater. What is clearer is that meltwater does not enter the global system evenly. There are pulses, moments when sea level appears to rise faster than usual. One of the best-known earlier examples is meltwater pulse 1A before the Younger Dryas, but the period after the Younger Dryas also includes major changes, including what researchers often discuss as meltwater pulse 1B around the early Holocene. Sea level reconstructions from places such as coral terraces help reveal these changes because corals grow within specific depth ranges, leaving markers of where the ocean once stood. The exact size, timing, and source of particular pulses can be debated, but the larger pattern is not in doubt. The oceans are climbing as ice returns to water, and that climb is capable of transforming human geography. A surprising part of this story is that some of the most dramatic changes may have seemed ordinary at first. A few centimeters of sea level rise in a year might not sound like a catastrophe. Even a meter over a lifetime may not look like a single disaster when watched day by day. But on low coastal plains, small vertical changes can move the shoreline far inland. A flat landscape does not need the sea to rise high before it loses great distances. Salt water enters marshes, tidal against, channels lengthen, storm surges reach farther, freshwater pools become brackish, camps that once sat safely behind dunes become exposed. People may move a little inland, then a little more, then a little more again, until the original place exists only in memory. The flood can be slow enough to adapt to and still permanent enough to become a wound. Meanwhile, in the mountains and ice margins, other waters move with terrifying speed. Glacial lake outburst floods can happen when ice dams, marine dams, or other natural barriers fail. The stored water escapes suddenly, sometimes with enough force to carve channels, move huge stones, and leave behind strange landscapes that later geologists must decode from gravel bars, scoured bedrock, and abandoned spillways. These are not the steady sea rising over generations. They are sudden releases, the kind of events that could enter memory as the day the valley broke. No single explanation fully accounts for all post-Ice Age flood traditions. But real local catastrophes like these provide a powerful foundation for understanding why water becomes such a dominant image in human stories. As the planet thaws, animals also respond. Cold-adapted species lose habitat as open steppe and tundra give way to forests in some regions. Large herbivores that once moved through broad Ice Age grasslands face shrinking ranges, changing vegetation, and increasing pressure from human hunters in certain areas. Other animals expand. Deer, wild boar, oryx, fish, waterfowl, and forest species become more important in many post-glacial environments. This ecological reshuffling matters because human societies are tied to the movements and habits of other life. A change in plant cover can change grazing patterns. A change in grazing patterns can change hunting routes. A change in rivers can change fish runs. A change in coastlines can alter shellfish beds. The thaw is not just water moving through land. It is the reorganization of food itself. And still the ice continues to surrender. Far away from any campfire in places no person may be watching directly, meltwater gathers under pressure. It grinds sediment beneath glaciers. It spills into proglacial lakes. It pours into seas that are slowly recovering their lost volume. The planet is returning to a warmer state. But that return is not a restoration of something simple. It is a passage into a new world. The old Ice Age map is being dismantled by sunlight, ocean, gravity, and time. And for the people alive. Then the thaw may have looked like contradiction. More water and more dry land, more abundance and more danger, more routes opening while old homelands vanished. The flood begins here, not as one wall of water, but as a planet remembering how to flow. The sea climbs inland without hurry, and that is part of its power. It does not always arrive as a roaring wall, not in the way later stories sometimes imagine. Often it comes as a quiet trespass. A tide reaches a little farther into a river mouth. A storm leaves salt water where fresh reeds once grew. A sandbar breaks. A lagoon opens behind the old beach. The ground near the shore becomes softer underfoot, then wetter, then unreliable. Shellfish beds shift. Fish gather in new channels. The familiar line between land and water stops being a line at all and becomes a zone of uncertainty, a moving border where memory and geography begin to disagree. For thousands of years before this, human beings have lived with coastlines very different from the ones known today. At the height of the last ice age, the sea sits far lower because we'll see so much water is trapped in ice. The exposed continental shelves are not empty wastelands. Many are broad, habitable landscapes with rivers, lakes, wetlands, dunes, forests, grasslands, and animal corridors. In some places, they connect lands now separated by sea. In others, they create wide coastal plains where people can move, hunt, fish, gather shellfish, collect plants, and return season after season. These places may have been among the most attractive human habitats of their time, precisely because coastlines concentrate resources. Yet, because they were low, open, and close to the sea, they were also destined to disappear. When the ocean rises, it does not merely cover land. It edits the archaeological record. Camps near old estuaries vanish beneath sediment and water. Hearths are scattered. Wooden structures rot or are destroyed by waves. Bone, fiber, hide, and plant remains disappear unless buried under rare protective conditions. Stone tools may survive, but they can be moved far from where people dropped them. A shell midden that once marked repeated visits to a rich shore can be cut apart by erosion or sealed beneath marine deposits. What survives in the record suggests so that ancient coastal life was important, but the evidence remains incomplete because so much of it now lies offshore, sometimes dozens or even hundreds of kilometers from the present coastline. This creates one of the great distortions in how the deep human past is understood. Archaeologists often find what survived, not necessarily what mattered most. Inland caves, rock shelters, and dry upland sites can preserve traces better than open coastal settlements. So, the surviving map of human activity can make ancient people seem more inland, more cave-bound, or more focused on certain landscapes than they really were. The drowned coast is a missing archive. It may have held migration routes, seasonal camps, fishing places, burial grounds, early experiments with plant use, boat landings, and social meeting points. Scholars still debate how much was lost under the post-glacial seas, but few doubt that the loss is enormous. The scale of that loss becomes clearer when one imagines not a single village swallowed, but entire regional worlds pushed back step by step. In Southeast Asia, the exposed Sunda Shelf once joins or nearly joins lands that are now separated by warm tropical seas. In the Persian Gulf Basin, low-lying landscapes that may have supported human movement and settlement are later flooded as the Indian Ocean advances around Britain and the North Sea. The land often called Doggeran survives for a time as a rich plain of rivers, marshes, and animals before gradually fragmenting and drowning around the Mediterranean Black Sea and many other coastal regions. Local stories differ, but the principle repeats. The present shoreline is not the ancient shoreline, and the missing land between them may once have been alive with human presence. The sea's advance is especially powerful on flat terrain. A vertical rise that appears modest in a graph can translate into a dramatic horizontal invasion. On a steep, rocky coast, the water may climb without moving far inland. On a shallow plain, it can travel great distances, turning river valleys into austerities, grasslands into marshes, marshes into lagoons, and lagoons into open water. People living there might not experience this as one catastrophe. Instead, they may experience a long series of losses. The old freshwater spring becomes salty. The path around the bay disappears at high tide. The place where animals cross, D, is flooded too often to trust. A storm breaks through the dune line and never fully gives the land back. This kind of change can be more psychologically haunting than sudden destruction because it attacks memories slowly. A person can remember walking across ground that is now underwater. A parent can point to a glittering inlet and say that their own parents once gathered food there on dry land. A group can return to a seasonal site and find that the sea has made return impossible. The displacement is not only practical, it is emotional and spiritual. Though the exact beliefs of these communities cannot be recovered with certainty, places matter to mobile hunter-gatherers just as they matter to settled farmers. A repeated camp, a burial, a lookout, a river bend, a stand of useful trees, a reef known for shellfish. These are not random dots on a map. They are part of how people belong to a landscape. Rising seas also change the relationship between humans and rivers. As the ocean pushes inland, river mouths migrate, estuaries widen. Tides travel farther upstream, fish and shellfish habitats shift, sometimes creating new abundance, even as older places vanish. This is one reason the story is not simply one of disaster. Coastal change can create opportunities. New wetlands can become extraordinarily rich. Estuaries can support dense seasonal gatherings. People may learn new fishing strategies, new routes, new patterns of return. The sea takes, but it also rearranges resources in ways that skilled communities can exploit. No single explanation fully accounts for the human response, because every coastline has its own slope, ecology, storms, currents, and cultural history. Still, adaptation has limits. It is one thing to follow a moving shoreline when inland space is open and resources remain accessible. It is another when rising water compresses people against mountains, deserts, rival groups, or unfamiliar territories. In some regions, sea level rise may have encouraged migration, conflict, exchange, or new social arrangements. People forced away from drowned coasts may have carried knowledge inland fishing techniques, stories of lost places, memories of dangerous water, and perhaps a sharper awareness that the world can change faster than tradition expects. The evidence for these movements is often indirect, but the logic is strong. When the map changes, human networks change with it. There is also the question of what ancient people could see coming. They were not measuring sea level with instruments, but they were not blind. They knew tides, storms, shorelines, animal patterns, and water quality with an intimacy most modern people have lost. They could observe when the land was changing, but observation does not always grant control. A community might understand that the sea is advancing and still be unable to stop it. They might retreat gradually, rebuild repeatedly, or hold on to a place because it remains useful until the very end. Human beings are often practical and sentimental at the same time. The old shore may be dangerous, but it is also known. By around 11,600 years ago, and in the millennia that follow, this advancing ocean becomes one of the great background forces of the early Holocene. It does not erase every coast at once, and it does not create one universal flood, but it steadily removes whole landscapes from the human world. Somewhere beneath modern waters lie valleys where people walked, riverbanks where fires burned, and shores where children learned the movements of birds and tides. The sea has covered them so completely that only fragments may ever return. A stone tool dragged up by a fishing net, a submerged forest, a drowned river channel mapped by sonar, a scatter of bones sealed in sediment. The flood is not only the water that came. It is the silence left afterward where a coastline full of human life became the floor of the sea, far from the coast where no tide can reach and no salt wind moves across the grass. Water still finds a way to become terrifying. It gathers quietly in high places, in basins carved by ice, in valleys blocked by frozen walls, behind ridges of loose stone and mud left behind by retreating glaciers. For a time, these lakes can look almost peaceful. Their surfaces reflect mountains, clouds, and the pale edge of ice. Birds may settle on them. Animals may come to drink at their margins. People may pass nearby and see only another cold body of water in a changing world. But some of these lakes are not stable lakes in the modern sense. They are pressure waiting for a weakness. They are floods held in place by ice, gravel, frozen sediment, or chance. When such a barrier fails, the landscape can change with a violence that makes ordinary river flooding seem small. A glacial lake outburst flood does not need rain in the local valley. It does not need a storm overhead. It can begin under clear skies, triggered by ice collapse, erosion, rising water, seismic disturbance, or simple structural failure inside the dam that held the lake back. Once the barrier gives way, water stored across years, decades, or centuries can surge downhill in hours or days. It carries boulders, trees, ice blocks, mud, and shattered sediment. It widens channels, tears through valley floors, strips soil from bedrock, and leaves behind deposits that later generations may find difficult to explain without imagining a force almost mythic in scale. In the post-Ice Age world, these events are part of the hidden machinery of deglaciation. As ice sheets and mountain glaciers retreat, they do not just melt into harmless streams. They create temporary plumbing systems across continents. Lakes rise where ice blocks drainage. Rivers are diverted through unfamiliar routes. Meltwater tunnels form beneath glaciers. Valleys that once carried modest streams become spillways for waters gathered from enormous regions. The earth becomes a system of unstable reservoirs, and the boundaries between lake, river, marsh and floodplain are no longer dependable. What survives in the geological record suggests that some of these floods were immense. But the evidence remains incomplete in many places because later erosion, vegetation, settlement and sea level rise have altered the traces. For anyone living near one of these waters, the first sign might have been sound. Not the sound of rain, but a deeper noise, a distant grinding, a rising roar carried through the ground before the water itself appeared. Animals may have reacted first, scattering from the valley floor. Birds may have lifted from marshes in sudden confusion. Then the river would swell beyond recognition. No longer a river in the ordinary sense, but a moving wall of debris-filled water. Crossings vanish. Gravel bars disappear. Trees bend, snap and spin in the current. If a camp stands too low, there may be no time to gather tools, food or the old people who cannot move quickly. A flood like this is not a season. It is an event that divides memory into before and after. The power of these outburst floods can be seen in landscapes that look oversized for the rivers that now occupy them, channels too broad for publication, NT streams, giant ripple marks, scoured rock, abandoned spillways, and erratic boulders all speak of water moving at volumes no ordinary local flood could produce. In some regions, scientists reconstruct the collapse of ice-dammed lakes by reading these marks like a broken script. They measure sediments, map channels, date deposits, and compare them with climate records. Scholars still debate the exact timing and scale of many ancient floods, but the broader lesson is clear. When the Ice Age ended, rivers did not merely rise. Some became temporary monsters. This matters for the idea of the Great Flood because human memory is shaped most strongly by events that exceed expectation. A slowly rising sea can erase a homeland across generations. A glacial outburst can erase a valley in a day. Both can become part of flood memory, but they do so differently. The sea teaches that the world can take land slowly and never return it. The outburst teaches that a familiar river can turn against the living with no warning. Later flood myths often combine these emotional truths. Water from below, water from above, rivers bursting boundaries, seas swallowing cities, mountains becoming refugees such as RVIZORs carrying memory into a changed world. No single explanation fully accounts for such stories, but real post-glacial floods give them a powerful natural foundation. Not every dramatic flood of this era comes from a glacial lake. Ordinary rivers also become more volatile as climates shift. When vegetation changes, soil stability changes. When permafrost thaws, slopes weaken. When rainfall patterns reorganize, floods become more or less frequent depending on the region. As glaciers retreat, they expose loose sediment that rivers can quickly cut through and carry away. A river fed by seasonal snowmelt, glacial melt. A new rainfall regime may shift from a familiar channel into a braided maze, then cut a new path entirely. Floodplains expand. Old banks fail. New wetlands appear in a world warming out of glaciation. The river is not only water. It is sediment, ice, memory, weather, slope, vegetation, and time moving together. For human communities, rivers are usually lifelines. They provide drinking water, fish, travel corridors, plant foods, animals, and materials such as reeds, clay, and stone. People return to river valleys because they are rich, but that richness brings vulnerability. A group camped near a river has access to food and movement, but also exposure to sudden change. The best place in one season may become the most dangerous place in another. Ancient people surely understood seasonal flooding in many regions, yet post-glacial instability could produce events outside inherited knowledge, DGE. A river known for generations may behave in a way no elder has seen before. In such moments, tradition remains valuable, but it no longer guarantees safety. There is lesser-known human consequence hidden here. Floods do not only kill or displace, they reveal. After waters tear through a valley, they can expose stone, clay, bones, old river gravels, and new resources. They can create fresh wetlands, leave fish trapped in pools, deposit fertile silt, and open new travel routes once the danger passes. People who survive may return to a changed valley and find both loss and opportunity. This dual nature of floodwater is one reason ancient flood stories are often morally and symbolically complex. Water destroys, but it also renews. It buries the old world, but it can leave behind the conditions for a new one. The evidence for specific beliefs this far back is beyond reach, but the lived contradiction is visible in the landscape itself. As the early Holocene approaches, these river catastrophes unfold alongside the slower drowning of coasts and the broader reshaping of climate. In some places, a community may experience both within cultural memory, the sea creeping over ancestral ground, while inland rivers grow unpredictable under the influence of melting ice and changing weather. People moving away from a coast might follow a river inland, only to find that rivers too are unstable. Others may settle near new lakes and wetlands, learning their cycles until those cycles change again. The world is offering abundance, but it is abundance with teeth: fish, reeds, birds, fresh water, and fertile margins all draw people close to the very places where flood danger is greatest. This is why the phrase "the flood" becomes too small. There are many floods. There are saltwater floods and freshwater floods, slow floods and sudden floods, floods that creep across a plain and floods that explode from a broken ice dam. Some leave thick deposits, some leave only absence. Some are remembered by descendants. Others vanish without a witness whose story survives. Yet together they create a world in which water is no longer background. It is a main actor in human history. It redraws maps, tests memory, opens routes, closes homelands, and forces people to understand that the ground beneath their lives is not permanent. By the time the great ice continues its retreat, rivers have become messengers from a collapsing frozen world. They carry the mountains downward. They carry the ice sheets toward the sea. They carry silt from newly exposed lands and the broken remains of forests and camps. They carry danger, food, and news of a planet changing faster than tradition can fully explain. Along their banks, human beings watch, adapt, flee, return, and remember. And somewhere in those memories, perhaps long before writing, long before kings, long before the first named flood heroes, a simple truth takes root. Water can come from places unseen, and when it does, even the strongest world can be swept away. Before the waters take the old places, people are already living close to them. They are not waiting on empty shores, and they are not wandering through a barren world with no memory of home. They know the shape of rivers, the taste of certain springs, the seasons when birds gather in wetlands, the places where fish move through shallow channels, the hidden paths of deer and wild cattle, the cliffs where stone can be struck into sharp flakes, and the sheltered ground where a fire can last through a cold night. Their world is not simple because it is prehistoric. It is complex in ways that rarely leave clear traces. It is a world of movement, return, observation, inherited knowledge, and countless small decisions made under skies that are beginning to change. The people living through the end of the Ice Age are mostly hunter-gatherers, though that term can make their lives sound more uniform than they were. Some groups follow large animals across open plains. Some return again and again to rivers full of fish. Some make seasonal use of coasts, wetlands, forests, and uplands. Some live in small bands for part of the year and gather in larger numbers when food is abundant. Their homes may be temporary, but their knowledge is not. A camp that lasts only days can still belong to a long pattern of return. A shoreline used for shellfish collection may be known across generations. A river crossing may carry stories, warnings, and social ties. What survives in the record suggests mobility, but mobility does not mean ruthlessness. This is one of the important corrections to the older image of Ice Age people as endlessly wandering after animals with no sense of place. Many ancient communities likely understood their territories with extraordinary precision. They may have known dozens or hundreds of useful locations. Winter shelters, summer hunting grounds, fishing places, stands of edible plants, sources of ochre, caves with dry floors, ridges good for watching herds, beaches where shellfish could be collected at low tide, and safe routes around marshes. Their maps were not drawn on paper. They were carried in memory, story, habit, and the trained senses of the body. A person could read a landscape not as scenery, but as instructions. Near rivers, life could be especially rich. Water draws animals, supports plants, and offers movement through the land. Fish traps, nets, hooks, spears, baskets, and other organic technologies may have existed far more widely than the surviving evidence can show. Because wood, fiber, and plant materials decay easily, stone tools dominate the archaeological record, not because stone was the only important material, but because stone endures. The missing technologies of perishable materials may have been central to survival. A person standing beside a late Ice Age river may have used a toolkit of bone points, wooden shafts, woven containers, hide coverings, plant cordage, resin adhesives, and stone blade. Most of which would disappear unless preserved under exceptional conditions. Coasts and wetlands add another layer. These environments can support dense and predictable resources compared with some inland settings. Shellfish do not run away. Fish return with tides or seasons. Water birds nest in large numbers. Reeds can be used for mats, baskets, shelters, or fuel. Driftwood arrives where trees may be scarce. Seaweed, eggs, seals, crabs, and coastal plants can all matter depending on the region. For people living near such places, the shore is not merely the edge of the land. It is a living machine of tides, migrations, winds, moon cycles, and seasonal abundance. Scholars still debate the full importance of coastal life in the late Ice Age because so many ancient shorelines are now submerged. But the possibility that coasts played a major role in human movement and survival is hard to ignore. Daily life before the floods is therefore not a picture of constant disaster. It is a picture of skill under pressure. A group may wake before dawn in a camp near a river bend where the smell of smoke hangs low in cold air. Someone checks the embers. Someone sharpens a blade. Children watch. Older hands split bone, scrape hide, sort shells, or prepare plant foods whose safe use depends on knowledge learned slowly. Tracks near the water are read like messages. The wind tells whether animals may smell approaching hunters. The sky tells whether a storm is building over distant hills. A broken tool is repaired. Meat is shared. Stories are told without writing. And because there is no writing, almost everything that matters most is vulnerable to silence. There is a surprising intimacy in this kind of life that often disappears when history begins with monuments. Long before temples and cities, humans are already shaping the world around them. They burn vegetation in some landscapes. They carry useful stones across distance. They transport shells, pigments, ornaments, and ideas. They form alliances, exchange partners, and maintain social networks that may stretch far beyond the range of any single group. Archaeological finds from the late Ice Age and early Holocene show that people are not isolated dots on a map. Objects move, styles move, genes move, stories almost certainly move as well. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests connection across landscapes. Pests that modern people might underestimate. This matters because when water begins to erase places, it does not erase only food sources, it disrupts networks. A flooded coastal plain may have been a corridor between groups. A drowned river mouth may have been a seasonal meeting place. A changed wetland may affect marriage ties, exchange routes, hunting agreements, and ritual gatherings. The loss of land can ripple through social life in ways that leave almost no direct archaeological trace. A stone tool found in land may not reveal that the people who made it once came from a vanished shore. A change in settlement pattern may hint at movement without preserving the grief or conflict behind it. No single explanation fully accounts for how each group responded because human decisions are never made by climate alone. Food pressures also vary. In some regions, the warming world creates new opportunities. Expanding forests, richer wetlands, more fish, more varied plant foods. In others, it weakens older ways of life. Large Ice Age animals decline or move. Open hunting grounds shrink. Cold-adapted species lose habitat. People who have long depended on certain animals may need to broaden their interests. Our diets, travel differently, or intensify use of smaller, more reliable resources. This process is not necessarily sudden, and it is not always desperate, but it is consequential. The end of the Ice Age encourages flexibility, and flexibility may become one of the defining human tools of the age. The communities before the floods are also communities before farming, but not before planning. Some may store food seasonally. Some may return to semi-permanent locations. Some may manage landscapes with fire or repeated harvesting. Some may already be developing deeper relationships with particular plants and animals that will later matter in the long path toward domestication. It would be a mistake to imagine agriculture appearing one day as a brilliant invention after a long emptiness. The foundations are older close observation, seasonal scheduling, experimentation, memory, and pressure. The early Holocene will build on skills already present among people who know how to survive in changing worlds. So when the floods come, they come to people who are intelligent, attentive, and deeply embedded in their environments. They're not primitive figures standing helpless before nature. They're experts in their own landscapes. That is what makes the transformation so powerful. The water does not wash over ignorance. It washes over knowledge. It takes places that have names we will never hear. Paths walked by people whose faces are gone, and seasonal rhythms that once made sense. It turns lived geography into archaeology, and then often into nothing visible at all. Before the Great Flood becomes myth, before it becomes a story told by later civilizations, it is first an interruption in ordinary human life, a camp moved higher, a shore abandoned, a river feared, a child learning that the place described by grandparents now lies beneath the water. The most important evidence may be exactly where it is hardest to reach, beneath the grey-green surface of modern seas, under fishing lanes, shipping routes, coral growth, sandbanks, mud, and cold tidal water. There are landscapes that once belonged to people, not symbolically, not as a poetic idea, but literally. Valleys now drowned once held rivers, plains now crossed by waves once held animal tracks. Forests grew where boats now pass. Fires burned on ground that has not seen open air for thousands of years. The vanished coasts are not empty margins of prehistory. They may be among its greatest missing libraries. This is one of the quietest problems in archaeology. The places most likely to preserve a long visible record are not always the places where people most wanted to live. Caves, rock shelters, dry uplands, and inland terraces can protect stone tools, bones, charcoal, and sediments. Coastal plains, by contrast, are often low, dynamic, and fragile. Yet for human beings, especially near the end of the Ice Age, coasts could be extraordinarily attractive. They offered food from land and sea, travel along beaches, access to freshwater rivers, shellfish beds, fish runs, birds, seals, edible plants and materials washed in by tides. A coastline can feed people in many seasons and allow movement without crossing mountains, deserts, or dense forests. If people followed coasts during migrations, if they gathered there season after season, if they developed rich local knowledge of tides and estuaries, then much of that story now lies underwater. The problem is not only that the sea rose, it is that it rose over the very places where the evidence might have been most abundant. During the Ice Age, lower sea levels east exposed broad continental shelves. These were not narrow beaches. In some regions, they were huge habitable worlds, wider than many modern countries. Rivers crossed them before reaching distant ancient shorelines. Lakes and marshes formed in their low places. Herds moved across them. Human groups could have used them as corridors, refuges, hunting grounds, fishing territories, and meeting zones. When the ocean returned, it did not cover a thin strip of forgotten sand. It drowned entire landscapes. Some of these lost lands have names now given by modern researchers because the people who knew their original names left no writing. Dogland beneath the North Sea is one of the most famous. For a time after the Ice Age, it connects or nearly connects Britain with mainland Europe through a broad land of rivers, marshes, lakes, and open ground. It is not a fantasy continent, not a lost empire, not Atlantis in northern form. It is a real post-glacial landscape, gradually transformed by rising seas until it fragments into islands and finally disappears beneath the water. Archaeologists and geologists reconstruct it from seabed sediments, ancient river channels, animal bones, pollen, and artifacts sometimes pulled up by trawlers. What survives suggests a rich environment, but the evidence remains incomplete, scattered by water, and recovered mostly by chance. Doggerland is only one example. Around the world, similar drowned landscapes lie hidden on continental shelves. The Persian Gulf Basin, parts of Sunda in Southeast Asia, the shelves around Australia, the coasts of India, the Mediterranean margins, the Black Sea region, the Americas, and many island chains all hold traces of lower sea level worlds. Not all were inhabited in the same way, and scholars still debate the details of human presence in many submerged regions. But the principle is global. Modern coastlines are not the coastlines of the late Ice Age. Human history did not begin on the dry land that happens to remain above water today. This changes the way the Great Flood must be imagined. If people lived on these now drowned plains, and sea level rise did not simply push water over unused ground, it erased paths, camps, territories, seasonal routines, and perhaps entire cultural landscapes. The loss is not always dramatic in the moment. A low plain may take centuries to drown. People may move repeatedly, adjusting to each new shoreline. But from the viewpoint of deep time, the disappearance is immense. Whole chapters of human life become difficult to read because the pages are soaked, buried, torn and scattered across the seabed. Underwater archaeology has begun to recover parts of this missing world, but it is difficult work. The sea is not a gentle archive. Waves break objects. Currents move sediment. Marine organisms bore into wood and bone. Sand can bury sites deeply, protecting them in some cases and hiding them in others. Visibility is often poor. Dating materials can be complicated. A stone tool found offshore may have been dropped by a human on dry land, moved by a river, exposed by erosion, or dragged by later currents. Every discovery has to be handled with caution. The evidence can be powerful, but it rarely speaks in a clean voice. Even so, there are moments when the drowned world comes suddenly close. A submerged forest appears at low tide with ancient tree stumps rooted in place beneath coastal mud. A fisherman's net brings up a barbed bone point from land that is now seabed. Divers find worked flint in sediments that once lay beside a river. Sonar reveals buried channel, L's crossing a continental shelf. Pollen from offshore cores shows what plants once grew there. Animal bones tell of mammoth, deer, aurochs or other species moving through regions now covered by water. These fragments do not give back the whole world, but they prove that the emptiness on the modern map is misleading. There is a lesser-known irony in this. The rise of the sea may have destroyed evidence in many places, but in some rare conditions, it can also preserve it. Rapid burial under fine sediment, low oxygen environments, peat, and submerged soils can protect organic material that would vanish on dry land. Wooden structures, plant fibers, footprints, and ancient surfaces sometimes survive underwater with astonishing clarity. The sea is both destroyer and keeper. It erases broadly, then preserves selectively, leaving archaeologists with a puzzle that is both frustrating and irresistible. Somewhere beneath layers of silt may be evidence that would transform what is known about early coastal life, migration, fishing, and settlement. But finding it is like searching for a memory under moving glass. The vanished coasts also complicate the question of when humans began to rely heavily on the sea. For a long time, coastal adaptation could seem relatively late because the clearest evidence was limited. But if older shorelines are underwater, then the absence of evidence on land cannot prove that ancient people ignored marine resources. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, and coastal plants may have mattered far earlier and more widely than the surviving record suggests. This does not mean every claim of ancient seafaring or coastal complexity should be accepted without evidence. It means the record is biased and good science has to account for that bias. For the people themselves, the drowning of coasts may have created a special kind of memory. Inland floods can be sudden and violent, but a coast that retreats across generations creates layered loss. Children grow up hearing about places they cannot visit because the sea has taken them. Elders may remember walking where waves now break. Stories may attach to offshore rocks, islands, shoals, or dangerous currents that once were hills, ridges, or river mouths. Over time, practical memory can become sacred memory. A warning about tides can become a tale of punishment. A remembered migration from a drowned plain can become the story of a people saved from water. The evidence remains incomplete and no direct line can be drawn from every submerged landscape to every later flood myth. But the emotional logic is powerful. This is why the missing archive beneath the sea matters so much. It is not just about finding older artifacts. It is about restoring scale to human experience at the end of the Ice Age. The Great Flood, understood carefully, is not one wave and not one date. It is a long transformation in which water removes a huge part of the human map. The people who lived through it may have adapted brilliantly, but adaptation did not prevent loss. Somewhere below the modern seafloor are the remains of worlds that shaped human memory and then disappeared before history could name them. The shore moved on, the stories moved inland, and the evidence sank into silence. Long after the water has moved on, memory remains. It does not remain perfectly. It does not preserve dates, measurements, sediment layers, or the slow mathematics of sea level rise. Memory does something older and more human. It keeps the feeling of the event. It keeps the terror of water where land should be, the shock of a river breaking its banks, the grief of leaving a place that can no longer feed the living, the image of hills becoming islands, the knowledge that survival depends on moving before it is too late. Over generations that memory changes shape. It gathers moral meaning, sacred meaning, warnings, names, heroes, gods, punishments, rescues, and impossible waters. What begins as lived disaster may become story. What begins as story may become myth, and myth, if handled carefully, may still carry the shadow of something real. Flood stories appear in many parts of the world. They are not all the same story, and they should not be forced into one simple origin. Some speak of divine anger, some describe a chosen survivor, some preserve the image of a boat, a mountain, a warning, a drowning world, or a new beginning after water. In Mesopotamia, flood traditions become part of some of the oldest written literature known. In Greek tradition, flood stories attach themselves to deep ancestral time. In South Asia, flood narratives carry their own theological and cultural meanings. Many indigenous traditions around the world include memories of rising seas, drowned lands, or waters that once covered places now inhabited. Scholars still debate how much historical experience lies behind any particular flood myth, and the evidence remains incomplete. But it would be equally careless to assume that all such stories are pure invention with no relationship to environmental memory. Human beings remember landscapes. This is not a poetic exaggeration. Oral cultures can preserve knowledge of roots, water sources, animal behavior, storms, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and dangerous places across long spans of time, especially when that knowledge matters for survival. A story may encode a warning: do not settle too low, do not ignore the old shoreline, do not cross this channel in the wrong season. Do not forget that the sea once came farther than anyone expected. Over time, the practical warning may become attached to ancestors, spirits, monsters, gods, or moral lessons. The surface of the story changes, but the geographical memory beneath it may still be visible. No single explanation fully accounts for this process everywhere. Yet, it gives a grounded way to think about why floods occupy such a deep place in human imagination. The end of the Ice Age provides an unusually strong background for such memories. Rising seas drown coastal plains across the world. Rivers become unstable in landscapes still adjusting to the loss of ice. Glacial lakes sometimes burst with catastrophic force. Storm surges reach farther inland as sea levels climb. Communities move away from places that older generations knew. These are not abstract processes. They are experiences that could be told, retold, and reshaped. A slowly advancing sea might become in story a great drowning. Original flood might become the destruction of the world, because for the people who lived there, it was their world. A group that survives by climbing to higher ground may remember a mountain as the place where life was preserved. A canoe, raft, or boat that saves a family during a local catastrophe may grow over centuries into the vessel that carries humanity through cosmic judgment. This does not mean that every flood myth points directly to the Younger Dryas, meltwater pulse 1b, or one specific event around 11,600 years ago. That would be too neat, and deep history is rarely neat. Floods happen in many places for many reasons. Monsoon failures and reversals, river floods, tsunamis, cyclones, storm surges, lake outbursts, volcanic events, and ordinary but devastating seasonal disasters. Later agricultural societies living on floodplains, especially along great rivers, had their own reasons to place water at the center of sacred stories. The Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, Indus, Yellow River, and many others could nourish and destroy in the same breath. Flood mythology is not a single fossil. It is a living family of stories shaped by many waters. Still, the timing of the post-Ice Age transformation gives the human imagination a vast reservoir of real experience. Around the transition into the Holocene, people witness a planet-changing state. The sea is rising toward modern levels. The old Ice Age coastlines are disappearing. Human groups are adjusting to new climates, new animal patterns, and new pressures. Some communities may have carried memories of drowned lands far inland. Others may have watched islands shrink or channels widen. In places like the exposed continental shelves, people may have lost territories so completely that later descendants could only gesture toward the sea and say that land had once been there. What survives in the record suggests that such changes were real, even if the exact stories attached to them are beyond recovery. This is where popular mystery often rushes too far. The idea of a single advanced civilization destroyed by a comet, flood, or sudden global cataclysm around 11,600 years ago has become attractive in modern culture because it offers drama, simplicity, and a hidden origin for later myths. Atlantis is often pulled into this frame because Plato's story places its destruction in a remote past that some people compare loosely with the end of the Ice Age. Writers such as Graham Hancock have popularized the possibility of a lost advanced civilization erased by catastrophe. These ideas are powerful as storytelling, but they remain unsupported as established archaeology. There is no accepted evidence for a technologically advanced global civilization destroyed at that date. The mainstream record instead points to diverse hunter-gatherer societies, emerging sedentism in some regions, complex symbolic life, regional innovation, and gradual transformations that eventually lead toward farming and settled communities. The difference matters. A grounded version of the mystery is not weaker, it is stronger. It does not need hidden machines, vanished empires, or impossible architecture beneath every sea. The real mystery is that ordinary humans without writing and without cities lived through a planetary environmental upheaval large enough to erase much of their world. Their tools were not steel engines or stone palaces. Their tools were memory, movement, cooperation, observation, fire, language, and inherited knowledge. If flood stories preserve anything from that age, they may not preserve the fall of an empire. They may preserve something more intimate, the knowledge that the ground of life can fail and that survival depends on listening to warnings before water arrives. Myth also transforms disaster into meaning. A flood is rarely just water in later stories. It becomes judgment, cleansing, renewal, punishment, mercy, forgetting, rebirth. That symbolic richness may come from the nature of floods themselves. Flood water destroys boundaries. It mixes fresh and salt, land and river, home and wilderness, human order and natural force. After a flood, the world looks newly made and violently emptied. Silt covers old surfaces. Dead trees stand in strange places. Bodies may vanish. Familiar paths disappear. At the same time, new fertile utility can follow. Plants grow in fresh deposits. Fish enter new pools. Wetlands form. The flood destroys and creates. And that double power is exactly the kind of experience that myth remembers well. So the memory of the Great Flood should be approached with caution but not dismissal. It is not proof that one worldwide deluge covered the planet. It is not proof of Atlantis, nor of a lost global civilization, but it may be evidence of something equally profound, that human societies carried environmental trauma forward in story, and that some stories grew from real encounters with water at the end of the Ice Age. The oldest written myths may be late echoes of much older oral worlds. Behind them may stand not one flood, but many. Not one drowned city, but countless drowned camps, shores, valleys, and river mouths. And somewhere in that long chain of memory, a child listens beside a fire while an elder speaks of a place the sea has taken. The child has never walked there. The elder did or heard from someone who did. The details are already changing. The lost shore becomes larger in the telling. The storm becomes darker. The escape becomes more miraculous. A warning becomes sacred. Emery becomes myth. Yet beneath the transformation, the water remains real. After the water comes the hunger, but it is not always the hunger of empty land. Sometimes it is the hunger of a world becoming too unfamiliar too quickly. The climate warms, forests spread, wetlands bloom, rivers shift, and coastlines move. Yet abundance does not appear everywhere in the same form. A place that once fed people through herds crossing open ground may now grow thick with trees. A valley that once held predictable plants may become wetter, darker, and harder to move through. A coastline that once offered shellfish and fish may retreat beyond reach. The world is not dying. It is changing its language, and every human group has to learn how to read it again. The end of the Younger Dryas and the arrival of the Holocene bring a new climatic background. Warmer and in many regions more stable than the sharp oscillations of the late Ice Age, but stability is relative for people living through the transition. The new world can feel anything but stable. Plant communities reorganize. Cold open steppe gives way to woodland in some places. Grasslands shrink or move. Lakes expand, then sometimes contract. Rushes appear along new watercourses. Animals that once ranged across huge Ice Age landscapes become harder to find in familiar places. Some species decline, others flourish. The menu of survival changes, and it changes unevenly from region to region. Large animals sit at the center of this transformation because they have long shaped Ice Age human life and imagination. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, steppe bison, wild horses, and other megapora belong to landscapes that are themselves changing. Their declines and disappearances are not caused by one simple factor everywhere. Climate change alters habitats. Human hunting adds pressure in some regions. Reproductive rates, migration barriers, vegetation shifts, disease, and ecological disruption may all play roles. Scholars still debate the balance between climate and human activity and late quaternary extinctions, and the answer likely varies by species and place. But for the people watching herds become less predictable, the scientific debate would not matter. The practical truth would be immediate. The old animals are no longer where they used to be. This does not mean humans face only loss. The warmer world offers new poetry, abilities. Forests bring deer, wild boar or rocks, nuts, berries, fruits, roots, mushrooms, honey, and smaller animals. Wetlands offer fish, waterfall, reeds, tubers, shellfish, and trapped seasonal abundance. Rivers and lakes become increasingly important in many regions. In some places, people broaden their diets, relying less on a few large animals and more on many smaller, dependable resources. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as a broad spectrum shift, though the pattern is not universal and does not happen everywhere at the same time. What survives in the record suggests that people are not simply starving toward farming. They're experimenting with abundance, risk, and reliability in a world where old certainties have weakened. The strange thing about abundance is that it can create pressure of its own. A rich wetland may feed many people, but it also draws people back repeatedly. A river full of fish may encourage longer stays. A stand of wild cereals may reward careful timing, repeated harvesting, and perhaps protection from animals or rival groups. A place where many resources overlap can become socially important. People may gather there seasonally, exchange matter, isles, find partners, share stories, settle disputes, perform rituals, or bury the dead. The line between mobile life and settled life is not a sharp wall. It is a series of habits. Returning to the same place becomes staying longer. Staying longer changes storage. Storage changes labor. Labor changes obligation. Obligation changes society. Climate affects this process not as a command, but as a pressure field. In the Levant and parts of Southwest Asia, for example, communities before and after the Younger Dryas experiment with more settled patterns, intensive plant gathering, and complex social life long before full agriculture dominates. The Nufian culture, often discussed in this context, shows how hunter-gatherers can become more sedentary, where wild resources are rich enough and social patterns support repeated occupation. The Younger Dryas may have disrupted some of these patterns by making conditions cooler and drier in certain areas, possibly increasing pressure on plant resources and encouraging new strategies. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the origins of agriculture. But the climate transition clearly changes the stage on which, I think, those decisions unfold. Hunger in this world is therefore not merely the absence of food, it is the instability of prediction. If the plants ripen at a different time, people must adjust. If animals move along new routes, hunters must learn them. If a shoreline retreats, fish traps and shellfish grounds may need to be abandoned. If a river floods unpredictably, a camp may have to shift uphill away from the very resources that made it valuable. A human group can know 1,000 details about survival and still be vulnerable when the calendar of nature changes. Knowledge built over generations does not become useless overnight, but it begins to require revision. There is a lesser-known emotional dimension here. Food is never just calories. It is memory, identity, skill, and season. The first salmon run, the return of birds, the gathering of nuts, the hunt in a known valley, the collection of shellfish at a certain tide. These are rhythms that hold communities together. When climate rearranges those rhythms, it also rearranges meaning. A food that once marked a season may fail. A place associated with plenty may become unreliable. A new resource may become important, but it has to be learned, named, processed, and woven into custom. The post-Ice Age world does not simply force people to eat differently. It asks them to become different kinds of experts. Some of those new forms of expertise leave traces. Grinding stones suggest plant processing, fish bones, shell mittens, and waterlogged tools suggest aquatic economies. Storage pits, house floors, repeated hearths, and cemetery sites suggest longer attachment to place in some regions. Changes in stone tool forms may reflect new hunting methods, woodworking, plant harvesting, or local traditions, yet much is missing. Nets, baskets, wooden traps, dugout canoes, cordage, mats, and carrying bags would have been enormously important, but they rarely survive. The early Holene may have been full of technologies that modern archaeology only glimpses in exceptional preservation. The people adapting to climate change were likely more technically inventive than the stone record alone implies. As hunger changes, movement changes. Some groups continue highly mobile lifeways following animals, seasons, and opportunities across large territories. Others narrow their ranges around productive wetlands or river valleys. Some move because the sea takes their coast. Others may move because forests close old hunting grounds. Still others may move toward new abundance. Migration is rarely one clean arrow on a map. It can be a widening of seasonal routes, a marriage connection, a split in a group, a return delayed too long, a camp relocated year after year until no one calls the old place home anymore. What survives in the records suggest both continuity and disruption, but the human reasons behind them are often hidden. The flood in this sense continues even after the water itself has passed. It continues as changed diets, changed routes, changed stories, and changed pressures. A drowned coast can push people inland. A new wetland can pull people toward it. A cold-adapted herd can vanish from memory while a river fishery becomes central to life. The world after 11,600 years ago is not simply a warmer version of the world before. It is a different ecological puzzle. Humans solve it not once but thousands of times in local ways with local knowledge under conditions that keep shifting. And from this pressure, slowly, unevenly, without any single inventor, some of the deepest transformations in human history will begin to gather. People stay longer where food is dependable. They harvest plants more carefully. They manage risk. They store. They return. They watch which seeds fall, which animals come close, which landscapes reward patience. The Great Flood does not create civilization by itself. No flood is that simple. But the watery end of the Ice Age helps reshape the world in which new forms of life become possible. Behind the later fields, villages, shrines, and myths, there is this earlier hunger not only for food, but for stability in a world that has just shown how easily stability can drown. The first settled worlds do not appear like sudden islands of civilization rising out of chaos. They gather slowly, almost quietly, in places where the new climate makes staying possible and pressure makes staying useful. After the long instability of the late Ice Age, certain landscapes begin to offer something rare: repeated abundance, not perfect safety, not endless food, not freedom from drought or flood, but enough predictability for people to return again and again until return begins to resemble residence. A river valley, a spring-fed basin, a lake shore, a stand of wild cereals, a corridor, rich with gazelle, nuts, birds, fish, and edible plants. These places become anchors in a changing world. The water has taken many old lands, but in other places it leaves behind new reasons to stay. In parts of Southwest Asia, especially the Levant and surrounding regions, the centuries around the end of the Ice Age become a turning point in how people use place. Long before cities, long before writing, long before kings or temples of stone in the later sense, communities begin living in ways that blur the line between mobile hunter-gatherer life and settled village life. The Nufian world is one of the clearest examples. These people are not farmers in the full later meaning of the word, yet they sometimes occupy substantial settlements, build houses or semi-subterranean structures, bury their dead in meaningful ways, harvest wild plants intensively, hunt, gather, and create a social landscape far more complex than old stereotypes of simple wandering bands allow. The Nufians matter because they show that settlement does not begin only after agriculture. In some places, settlement comes before farming, or at least before domesticated crops and animals dominate the economy. This is one of the lesser known but crucial details in the story of civilization's roots. People do not first invent wheat fields and then suddenly decide to live together. In some regions, they already gather in favored places because wild resources are rich, because social networks benefit from repeated contact, because storage becomes useful, because the dead tie the living to a location, and because the landscape offers enough to make longer residence possible. Farming grows out of this world of attention and return. It is not a lightning strike in an empty wilderness. The end of the Younger Dryas plays into this story in complicated ways. Before the Younger Dryas, warmer and wetter conditions in some regions may have encouraged more settled patterns among hunter-gatherers. Then the cold, dry interruption may have placed pressure on these systems, making certain wild resources less reliable and forcing communities to adjust. When the Younger Dryas ends around 11,600 years ago, the Holocene climate opens new possibilities, but not in a simple straight line. Some areas become more favorable. Others face drought, erosion, or changing vegetation. Scholars still debate exactly how climate stress, population pressure, resource abundance, and cultural choice combined in the emergence of settled life and later agriculture. No single explanation fully accounts for it, but the timing makes one thing clear. These social changes unfold in the shadow of a planet that has just been dramatically rearranged. Settlement changes the human relationship to water. For highly mobile groups, a flood may destroy a camp, but movement remains built into the rhythm of life. For people staying longer in one place, water becomes both foundation and threat. A spring can support repeated occupation. A stream can water plants and attract animals. A lake can provide fish and birds. Seasonal rains can fill basins with life. But the more a community invests in a place, the more vulnerable it becomes to that place's failure. A flood can now damage structures, storage, graves, and shared spaces. A drought can threaten not only a temporary camp, but an entire social routine. The first settled worlds are born not from escaping nature, but from binding human life more tightly to particular natural systems. Houses change memory. A structure with a floor, walls, posts, hearths, and repeated repairs creates a different, ferent sense of time than a temporary shelter. It gathers traces. Ash builds up. Tools are lost in corners. Food is processed in familiar spots. Bodies may be buried beneath or near living spaces. Children grow up knowing not only a territory but a built place within it. The archaeology of early settlements often reveals this intimacy: packed floors, grinding stones, hearths, pits, stone foundations, beads, shells, bones, pigments, and burials. These remains are modest compared with later monuments, but they mark a profound shift. A place is no longer only revisited. It is inhabited deeply enough to accumulate biography. Food storage may be one of the quiet revolutions of this period. Storage turns seasonal abundance into delayed survival. It allows gathered seeds, nuts, dried meat, or other resources to matter beyond the moment of collection. But storage also changes social life. Stored food has to be protected. It can be shared, stolen, inherited, counted, displayed, or controlled. It encourages planning and creates new forms of obligation. A group that stores food may be able to stay longer through lean seasons, but it may also become more tied to the place where storage happens. What survives in the record suggests that early sedentism and storage are deeply connected in some regions. though the details remain debated because many storage containers and organic materials rarely survive. The dead also help settle the living. Burial grounds, especially repeated burials in or near settlements, create powerful ties to place. A landscape that holds ancestors is not easily abandoned even when conditions worsen. In the deep past, exact beliefs cannot be reconstructed with certainty. But the act of returning bodies to a particular place suggests that location has meaning beyond practical food gathering. The dead become part of the architecture of belonging. In a world where coastlines have moved, rivers have shifted, and older territories have vanished, the creation of fixed places for memory may have carried special force. A grave says in effect, "This place matters enough to hold us." Yet these communities are not miniature cities waiting to happen. They are experiments, and experiments can fail. Some early settlements are abandoned, some shrink, some change form. People may return to mobility when conditions demand it. The road toward agriculture and village life is not a one-way staircase. It is a braided path with retreats, pauses, and regional differences. The evidence remains incomplete, but it strongly suggests that early Holocene societies are flexible, not trapped in a single destiny. They test possibilities offered by the New World, staying, storing, harvesting, gathering, building, burying, moving again. The Great Flood belongs in this story not because it magically creates settlement, but because the watery transformation of the planet changes the value of stable places. When seas rise and old coastal worlds vanish, when rivers shift and climate tests reorganize, places that remain productive and predictable become more important. Springs, uplands, fertile corridors, lake margins, and seasonal plant zones may become refugees of continuity. People do not need to think in grand historical terms. They need to know where food returns, where children can sleep, where the dead can rest, where water can be trusted most of the time. From that practical search for stability, new forms of society begin to take root. So the first settled worlds are not the opposite of the flood. They are part of its aftermath. They emerge from the same age of melting ice, moving seas, shifting animals, and changing hunger. There are human answers to uncertainty built not with empires or armies, but with hearths, storage pits, repeated paths, shared labor, and memory fixed into ground. The old world has not fully disappeared, and the new one is not yet civilization. But something has changed. People are beginning to hold certain places more tightly, just as the planet has shown that places can be lost. Stone appears before the fields in ways that still feel difficult to explain. Not because it proves a lost empire, and not because it requires forgotten achines or vanished masters, but because it shows something more subtle and perhaps more unsettling. Long before cities, long before writing, long before metal, some human communities are already gathering labor, memory, belief, and landscape into places that outlast ordinary life. In the hills and plains of Southwest Asia, at the edge of the early Holocene, people begin shaping stone with a seriousness that seems to belong to a later world. The climate has shifted. The ice age has loosened. Water has redrawn coasts and rivers. People are staying longer in certain places. And then in some places they begin to build not only for shelter, but for meaning. This is where sites such as Göbekli enter the story, not as evidence of an advanced lost civilization, but as evidence that hunter-gatherers and early settled communities were capable of extraordinary social and symbolic complexity. Rising from a limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, Göbekli contains monumental circular and oval enclosures, carved pillars, animal reliefs, and carefully arranged stone architecture dating to the early Neolithic. Its oldest phases reach back close to the beginning of the Holocene near the Bar, long aftermath of the Younger Dryas. The people who built and used these spaces were not city dwellers in the later sense. They did not leave writing. They were not living in a world of kings, armies, or bureaucrats. Yet they could organize labor, quarry and shape stone, carve powerful animal forms, and return to a place with shared purpose. That is the real shock. The old assumption was often that farming comes first, then surplus, then villages, then temples. GBE site and related sites complicate that sequence. They suggest that ritual gathering, social cooperation, and symbolic architecture may have played a role before or alongside the full development of agriculture. In other words, People may not have settled and farmed only in order to build sacred places. In some cases, sacred gathering places may have helped draw people together, intensify food needs, strengthen networks, and encourage new forms of settlement and cultivation. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between ritual, feasting, sedentism, and domestication. But the simple ladder from survival to farming to religion no longer feels adequate. The carved animals matter. Foxes, snakes, bow, birds, aurochses, Scorpio, NS and other figures appear on pillars and stones, sometimes with a force that feels almost alive even after 11,000 years. These are not decorative animals in a casual sense. They belong to a world where humans are negotiating their place among powerful non-human presences. Some animals may represent danger, others may evoke hunting, identity, season, myth, or clan memory. The exact meanings are lost, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the imagery suggests a symbolic universe intensely connected to the wild. This is not yet the tame landscape of farms and fenced herds. It is a world where humans gather beneath the gaze of animals they hunt, fear, imitate, and perhaps revere. The timing gives the stones an added gravity. After the Ice Age, people are living through a landscape of profound uncertainty and opportunity. Old animal worlds are shifting. Wild cereals grow in some surrounding regions. Herds move through changing habitats. Water sources, springs, and seasonal routes matter deeply. A site built on a ridge visible across a broad landscape may function as more than a shrine. It may be a meeting point, a memory anchor, a place where scattered groups gather at certain times. To exchange food, partners, stories, obligations, and perhaps grief. In a world where coastlines have been lost and climates have changed, fixed symbolic places may become especially powerful. The stone holds when water moves. Feasting may have been one part of this transformation. Large gatherings require food beyond the needs of a small band. They require planning, cooperation, hunting, plant collection, storage, and perhaps brewing or special preparation in some later contexts. A feast is not just eating. It is alliance, competition, display, generosity, obligation, and memory. If people gather at monumental sites for rituals or ceremonies, they must also solve the practical problem of feeding everyone. That pressure may encourage more intensive harvesting of wild grains, closer attention to animal movements, and repeated occupation of nearby places. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of agriculture, but ritual gathering may have been one of the forces that changed how people related to food. Other sites in the broader region deepen the mystery without turning it into fantasy. Karahan and other early Neolithic places in southeastern Anatolia show that Göbekli was not an isolated miracle standing outside human history. It was part of a broader world of experimentation, building, carving, gathering, and social change. Some sites have stone pillars, some have special buildings, some contain strange sculptural forms, human-like figures, animal imagery, and spaces that seem set apart from ordinary domestic life. The details vary and interpretations remain debated, but together they reveal a cultural landscape far richer than the old image of small, simple post-Ice Age bands slowly stumbling toward farming. These stones also force a more careful idea of what civilization means. If civilization is defined strictly as cities, writing, states, and class systems, then these sites are not civilizations. But if the word is used loosely to mean complex shared life, then it is not clear what it means. Symbolic depth, large-scale cooperation, and inherited tradition, then the roots go deeper than cities. The people of this era are not less intelligent because they lack writing. They are not less spiritual because they lack temples in the later architectural sense. They are not less historical because their stories were spoken instead of recorded. What survives in the records suggests that human imagination is already building worlds inside worlds, practical landscapes of food and water, and symbolic landscapes of animals, ancestors, danger, and transformation. The flood belongs here as atmosphere more than direct cause. It would be too simple to say that rising seas or meltwater floods created Gobes. The evidence does not support that kind of straight line. But the broader age of climatic disruption, ecological change, and social reorganization forms the background. People who have seen landscapes alter within inherited memory may feel a stronger need for gathering places. Communities adjusting to new resources may strengthen rituals that bind groups together as hunting worlds change and plant use intensifies. Shared ceremonies may help manage cooperation and identity. The stones do not need to be monuments to a flood in order to belong to a world shaped by water, warming, and loss. There is also a striking contrast between the fragility of the drowned coasts and the durability of carved limestone. Camps vanish beneath the sea. Wooden tools decay. Nets, baskets, boats, and shelters disappear. But stone pillars endure. This imbalance can mislead. It makes the ritual plate CES seem more central than the ordinary lives around them simply because they survive better. Yet perhaps that was part of their purpose even then. To build in stone is to resist disappearance. It is to make a claim against time. For people living after an age when coastlines moved, rivers broke, and old places vanished, stone may have carried a kind of stubborn authority. It remains when memory weakens. By the early Holocene, then the human story is no longer only about survival after environmental change. It is about meaning after environmental change. People are not merely finding new foods and safer camps. They're gathering around images, structures, rituals, and places that suggest a deep need to order the world. The floodwaters have not created civilization in a single dramatic act, but they have helped reveal the instability of the ground beneath human life. In response, humans do what they have always done at their most vulnerable and most brilliant. They make patterns, they make stories, they make places where the living can stand together and feel for a while that the world has a center. Farming does not begin as a thunderclap. It begins as a habit repeated often enough to become a new relationship with the earth. A hand cuts wild grain and returns the next season to the same slope. Seeds fall near a camp and sprout where people notice them. A patch of useful plants is protected, cleared around, harvested carefully, perhaps burned, perhaps watered by chance, perhaps visited at exactly the right time because someone remembers when the heads ripen. Animals are watched, followed, trapped, driven, and gradually understood with a closeness that changes both species. No one wakes one morning and invents agriculture as a finished system. The farming threshold is crossed slowly, unevenly by people who are still hunters, gatherers, fishers, foragers, builders, storytellers, and survivors of a world that has recently become unstable. After the great environmental changes around the end of the Ice Age, the value of reliable food becomes sharper. The sea has taken lowlands, rivers have shifted, forests have expanded in some regions, while grasslands have retreated. Large animals no longer offer the same predictable patterns everywhere. Wetlands and wild plant zones become more important. In parts of Southwest Asia, wild cereals grow in landscapes where people already know how to harvest, process, store, and return. These plants are not yet domesticated in the later biological sense, but they are becoming central to human attention. The difference between gathering and cultivation is not always obvious at first. A community can harvest wild grain intensively for generations before the plants themselves begin to show the traits archaeologists recognize as domestication. This is one of the quieter evolutions in human history. Domestication is not only a cultural decision, it is also an evolutionary process. Wild cereals naturally scatter their seeds when ripe, allowing the plant to reproduce without human help. But people harvesting with sickles may favor plants whose seed heads remain intact long enough to be collected. Over time, if seeds from those plants are replanted, whether intentionally or through repeated human disturbance, the plant population changes. The field becomes less wild. The harvest becomes more dependable. The human hand does not need to understand genetics to shape genetics. It only has to repeat a preference long enough for biology to answer. The same slow intimacy develops with animals. Dogs are already part of humanity. End life long before the full agricultural revolution. But other animals enter human systems later and in different ways. Goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs are not domesticated all at once, nor in one identical pattern. Some may first be hunted selectively. Some may be managed near settlements. Young animals may be captured, protected, culled, or bred under conditions that gradually alter behavior, body size, horn shape, reproduction, and dependence on human-controlled landscapes. Scholars still debate the precise pathways of domestication in different regions, and the evidence remains incomplete because early management can look archaeologically similar to hunting. But the direction is clear. Humans begin to draw certain species into a shared future. The flood-haunted world helps explain why this change matters, though it does not reduce agriculture to a simple reaction to disaster. Farming is not merely what people do because they are starving. In some places, cultivation grows from abundance, from repeated access to useful plants, from social gatherings, from feasting, from storage, from ritual obligations, from population pressure, from territorial attachment, and from the desire to make uncertain resources more predictable. No single explanation fully accounts for the farming threshold. It is not one invention and not one cause. It is a long convergence of climate, ecology, memory, experimentation, and social life. Still, the end of the Ice Age changes the stakes. In a world where coastlines have moved and animal worlds have shifted, food that can be encouraged to grow near home carries a new kind of power. Grain can be stored. Stored grain can bridge lean seasons. A managed herd can walk with the community or remain near a settlement. Plants that return in known places can support longer residence. These changes do not make life easier in every way. Farming often demands harder labor, closer scheduling, new vulnerabilities to drought, pests, crop failure, and disease. But it also offers a form of control that becomes increasingly attractive in a world where older patterns have proved breakable. The first cultivators do not leave the wild behind. For a very long time, early farming exists beside hunting, gathering, fishing, and foraging. People plant or tend some species while still depending on wild nuts, fruits, gazelle, deer, fish, birds, shellfish, and seasonal plants. This mixed economy is important because it prevents the story from becoming too clean. The threshold is crossed back and forth. Some communities adopt cultivation and later abandon it. Some intensify plant use without becoming fully agricultural. Some remain successful hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. Agriculture spreads not because it is instantly superior in every context, but because under certain conditions it supports population growth, settlement, storage, and social forms that become difficult to reverse. As people stay longer, the landscape around them changes. Repeated harvesting alters plant communities. Grinding stones wear smooth under countless motions. Storage pits are dug, filled, emptied, repaired. Houses are rebuilt on old floors. Refuse accumulates. Paths become clearer. The smell of smoke, grain dust, animal hides, damp earth, and stored food becomes part of settled life. A child born in such a place grows up not only with the territory but with an inherited architecture of work. There are places where grain is processed, places where tools are repaired, places where food is stored, places where the dead lie close beneath or beside the living. The world becomes more fixed, and because it is more fixed, it becomes more vulnerable to loss. Water remains central. Early cultivation depends on rainfall, springs, seasonal runoff, river margins, and the careful reading of soil moisture. Too little water, and plants fail. Too much water and fields rot, wash away, or become buried. Floodplains can be generous because they renew soil and concentrate life, but they are also dangerous because they can erase labor in a single season. This ancient bargain with water will define agricultural civilization for millennia. The same force that destroyed old coastal worlds becomes the force farmers must catch, fear, channel, and remember. Later irrigation systems, canals, levees, and river myths all grow from this basic truth. Farming ties human hope to water more tightly than ever before. There is a surprising psychological change hidden in cultivation. A hunter may track the movement of animals. A gatherer may know when wild plants ripen. But a farmer must think in delayed time with unusual intensity. Seeds placed into soil are promises made to the future. Harvest depends on patience, weather, protection, labor, and luck. The calendar becomes heavier. Seasons acquire new urgency. Failure can no longer be answered only by moving on, especially once houses, stores, graves, and social obligations bind people to place. This does not mean farmers are less flexible than foragers, but their risks are different. Their lives become increasingly invested in staying. A farming threshold also changes memory. A flood that destroys a mobile camp is frightening. A flood that destroys stored grain, fields, houses, and ancestral graves becomes a deeper social catastrophe. Once people build more permanent worlds, disaster has more to take. At the same time, settled communities are better able to preserve and retell stories across generations in fixed places. The memory of water may become attached to fields, shrines, burial grounds, and origin traditions. The old post-Ice Age floods become part of a longer agricultural imagination in which water is both blessing and judgment. By the early Holocene, the path toward farming is no longer a distant possibility. It is unfolding in real landscapes, through real hands, in small repeated acts. The Great Flood does not stand behind it as a single cause, but as part of the wider transformation, that makes stability precious and uncertainty unforgettable. People who have inherited a world of moving shorelines and shifting rivers begin to coax permanence from seeds, animals, houses, and memory. They cannot stop the sea. They cannot command the rain, but they can plant, store, tend, return, and build. In that fragile effort to make the future more predictable, the deep foundations of the later human world begin to take root. What survives is rarely the flood itself. Water does not leave behind a memory in the way a human witness does. It leaves mud, gravel, chemistry, broken shells, drowned roots, shifted pollen, scarred stone, buried soils, and layers that do not belong where they are found. The ancient world has to be read through these traces, not as a single clear message, but as a damaged archive. A shoreline moves, and the evidence may lie beneath meters of sediment. A lake bursts, and the violence appears later as boulders scattered in impossible places. A climate cools or warms, and the change is preserved in ice, cave stone, plankton shells, lake mud, and the invisible ratios of atoms. The Great Flood, if understood as the watery transformation around the end of the Ice Age, is not found in one universal layer. It is reconstructed from many quiet witnesses that agree only when studied patiently. Mud is one of the most important witnesses because it records time in layers. At the bottom of lakes, wetlands, river basins, and coastal lagoons, sediment settles year after year. Fine particles fall through still water. Pollen grains drift in from surrounding plants. Charcoal from fires washes in. Shells, insect remains, microscopic algae, and chemical signals accumulate in thin sequences that can be sampled with cores. To the eye, a sediment core may look like a column of dark, pale brown, gray, or black material, hardly dramatic at all. But inside it is a history of changing vegetation, rainfall, erosion, temperature, salinity, and sometimes human presence. A shift from pollen of cold open landscapes to pollen of warmer woodland can mark ecological transformation. A sudden sand layer inside fine lake mud may suggest a flood, storm, or rapid disturbance. A change in microscopic organisms may reveal that fresh water became brackish as the sea pushed inland. Ice cores preserve a different kind of memory. In Greenland and Antarctica, snow falls, calm, presses, and becomes ice, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient air and chemical traces from the atmosphere. Layers of ice can record temperature shifts, dust, volcanic eruptions, greenhouse gases, and abrupt climatic changes. Around the Younger Dryas and its ending, ice core records help reveal that the climate system did not move smoothly from glacial cold into Holocene warmth. It jolted, it reorganized. The details vary by region and archive, and scholars still debate exact mechanisms and timing. But the evidence shows that abrupt climate change is not a modern invention. The ancient atmosphere itself carries the trace of instability. Corals, too, become witnesses. This may seem unexpected because coral reefs feel far removed from melting ice sheets and northern floodwater. Yet, corals grow in relation to sea level. Some reef-building corals occupy specific depth zones, and when ancient coral terraces are dated, they can reveal where sea levels stood at different times. In places such as Barbados and other tropical reef systems, coral records have helped researchers reconstruct rapid sea level rise during meltwater pulses. The exact size and timing of particular pulses can be debated, but the broader message remains powerful. The ocean did not rise evenly like water in a slow bowl. At times it climbed faster, driven by the melting of distant ice. A coral skeleton in warm water can therefore preserve news from ice sheets thousands of kilometers away. Pollen is another small but extraordinary clue. Each plant produces pollen with a recognizable form, and those grains can survive in sediments for thousands of years. When researchers analyze pollen from ancient lake beds, bogs, or offshore cores, they can reconstruct changing vegetation around a site. More grass and herb pollen may suggest open steppe or tundra-like conditions. More tree pollen may indicate forest expansion. A rise in certain wetland plants may show that water levels changed. A decline in cold-adapted species may mark warming. The lesser-known power of pollen is that it can reveal not just climate but the human consequences of climate. If forests spread into former open hunting grounds, the animals using those lands may change, and so may human strategies. If edible plants expand near settlements, people may return more often. A grain of pollen is tiny, but it can point toward an altered way of life. Shells and microalgae add yet another layer. In coastal sediments, the species present can reveal whether an environment was marine, brackish, freshwater, tidal, or lagoonal. A core taken from what is now dry land may show that the sea once entered there. A core from offshore may reveal old river mud beneath marine sand, marking a drowned valley. Foraminifer, datums, ostrach, mollusks, and other small organisms respond sensitively to salinity, temperature, water depth, and oxygen levels. Their remains allow scientists to reconstruct environments that no human one has seen for millennia. The evidence remains incomplete because preservation is uneven and interpretation can be difficult. But these small forms of life often speak more clearly than large ruins. Drowned landscapes are studied with tools that turn the seafloor into a kind of hidden topographic map. Sonar, seismic profiling, sediment sing, underwater excavation, and remote sensing can reveal ancient river channels, submerged forests, buried peat, former shorelines and surfaces once exposed to air. In some places, peat layers beneath marine sediments show that a marsh or forest existed before the sea covered it. Tree stumps teed in place, prove that land once stood where waves now move. Ancient river valleys can be traced across continental shelves, showing the paths people and animals may have followed when sea level was lower. These discoveries matter because they restore geography to a period too often imagined only from modern maps. The people of the late Ice Age did not live beside our coastlines. They lived beside coastlines that in many regions are now gone. Flood deposits can be more dramatic, a sudden layer of coarse gravel inside fine sediments. Boulders too large for present rivers to move. Scoured bedrock, giant current ripples, and abandoned channels can point to water moving at immense force. But even here, caution is essential. A dramatic deposit does not automatically mean one specific legendary flood. It must be dated, compared with local geology, tested against alternative explanations, and placed in regional context. Some layers may come from storms, tsunamis, river floods, glacial lake outbursts, slope failures, or repeated events, rather than a single catastrophe. No single explanation fully accounts for all flood evidence, and careful science often makes the story more complex rather than simpler. Human traces are woven through this environmental archive, but they are uneven. A stone tool sealed beneath marine sediment may show that people once used a drowned landscape. A shell mitten may indicate repeated coastal gathering. Charcoal may suggest fire, though natural fires must also be considered. Grinding stones, fish bones, plant remains, and house floors show changing diets and settlement habits. Ancient DNA from human remains where it survives can reveal migration, population continuity, and mixture, though it rarely tells the whole social story. The archaeological record is strongest when many lines of evidence point together: climate data, sea level curves, sediments, tools, bones, plant remains, and settlement patterns. This is why the mud matters. It prevents the Great Flood from becoming only myth, but it also prevents it from becoming simplistic. The evidence does not show one neat global deluge sweeping over all humanity at once. It shows a planet emerging from ice through a complicated sequence of warming, cooling, melting, rising seas, regional floods, ecological change, and human adaptation. That may be less tidy than legend, but it is more powerful. Because it is real. The mud preserves not a single story, but the conditions from which many stories could grow, and there is still more hidden than found. Much of the ancient coast remains underwater. Many river valleys have been eroded, buried, or built over. Many camps left no durable trace. Many memories died before writing began. What survives is partial but not silent. In course of sediment, in coral terraces, in ice, in pollen, in drowned forests and old shorelines, the world keeps fragments of its transformation. The flood did not leave one monument. It left the planet itself marked, layer by layer, with the evidence of water changing the fate of human life. The deeper the evidence is followed, the more the Great Flood stops looking like one event and begins to look like a pattern. This does not make it less important, it makes it more human. A single global deluge is simple to imagine: one sky darkening, one ocean rising, one world drowning beneath a universal catastrophe. But the Earth at the end of the Ice Age tells a more complicated story. It shows rising seas that move differently from coast to coast, rivers swollen by meltwater, glacial lakes breaking through UN's table barriers, storms pushing farther inland over newly flooded shelves, wetlands forming and failing, and communities forced to adjust to water in many forms. The ancient flood was not one flood. It was many floods unfolding across different places at different speeds with different consequences until human memory may have gathered them into something larger than any single event. This distinction matters because it separates grounded mystery from easy exaggeration. The evidence does not support the idea that one worldwide flood covered all land and destroyed a single global civilization around 11,600 years ago. It does not show a universal layer of flood sediment blanketing the planet. It does not reveal the ruins of a lost technological empire erased in one day. What it does show is a world undergoing enormous hydrometeorological change. Sea level is rising as ice melts. Coastal plains are disappearing. Some landscapes are drowned gradually. Others are struck by sudden freshwater catastrophes. Climatic systems are reorganizing after the Younger Dryas. In human terms, this is more than enough to create disaster, migration, grief, adaptation, and story. The power of flood memory lies, partly in the scale of experience. For a small community, the world is not the globe as seen from space. The world is the known territory, the river bend, the coast, the hunting plain, the spring, the burial ground, the seasonal route, the ridge where people watch animals move. If all of that is destroyed, then the world has ended in every meaningful human sense. A valley flood that kills relatives, erases camps, and changes the river forever can become a total catastrophe in memory. A shoreline that retreats until ancestral places lie under waves can become the drowning of a homeland. A storm surge that sweeps across a low plain can become the sea breaking its boundary. Later retellings may enlarge the event, but the emotional truth begins locally. Different kinds of floods leave different kinds of memories. A glacial lake outburst is sudden, violent, and nearly impossible to predict without modern understanding. It lends itself to stories of warning ignored, water released from a hidden place, or a valley destroyed in a single day. Rising seas are slower, but their finality is terrifying. They create stories of lost lands, drowned paths, islands that were once hills, and people moving inland while the old shore vanishes behind them. River floods are seasonal, recurring, and often tied to fertility. So they produce a more ambiguous imagination: water as destroyer and giver of life. Tsunamis and storm surges where they occurred bring another pattern: the sea withdrawing or behaving strangely, then returning with force. No single explanation fully accounts for every flood tradition, because flood traditions may come from many experiences blended across time. The end of the Ice Age is especially fertile ground for this blending, because change lasts long enough for generations to inherit it. A child hears that the sea once stood far away. That child grows old and sees it closer still. Their grandchildren know islands where their ancestors knew hills. Inland relatives tell of a river that once broke through the valley after the ice failed. Travelers bring stories from another coast where the water swallowed camps over centuries. These separate accounts can merge. The flood becomes not one family's disaster, but the memory of an age when water repeatedly crossed the limits people expected it to obey. This is how myth often works. It compresses, it selects, it gives shape to experiences too scattered or painful to preserve as plain report. 1,000 local losses become one great drowning. Many escapes become one chosen survivor. Many boats become one sacred vessel. Many high places become one mountain of refuge. Many warnings become one divine message. This does not make myth false in the simple sense. It means myth speaks in another register. It may preserve the emotional structure of catastrophe long after the practical details have changed. Scholars still debate how far back oral memories can reliably reach, and the evidence remains incomplete. But it is plausible that some flood traditions carry echoes of real environmental events, even if those echoes have been transformed beyond precise historical reconstruction. At the same time, caution is necessary. It is tempting to take every ancient flood story and trace it directly to the end of the Younger Dryas, meltwater pulse 1b, or one dramatic moment around 11,600 years ago. That temptation should be resisted. Many flood myths were written down thousands of years later by agricultural societies living beside dangerous rivers. Mesopotamian flood stories, for example, emerge from a world where the Tigris and Euphrates could bring both life and ruin. South Asian traditions develop in landscapes shaped by monsoon, river, and cosmic cycles. Greek flood myths belong to their own mythic and cultural world. Similarity does not prove a single origin. Water is a universal human concern, and floods happen everywhere people live near rivers, lakes, coasts, and storms. Yet the similarities still matter because they show how deeply water shapes human imagination. Floods erase boundaries more completely than many other disasters. Fire burns, but land remains. Earthquakes break, but the ground is still there. Drought empties, but the horizon survives. Floodwater transforms land into something else. It makes paths disappear. It hides bodies. It covers fields, camps, graves, and familiar stones beneath the surface that reflects the sky as if nothing had ever been there. When the water withdraws, the world may be coated in mud, rearranged, fertile, and unrecognizable. It is destruction that looks like creation, and that dual nature gives flood stories their strange moral power. The disputed theories surrounding this period often grow from a real sense that something enormous happened. The mistake is in forcing that enormous thing into a single spectacular answer. A comet impact destroying a lost advanced civilization is dramatic. Atlantis sinking at the exact threshold of the hole in the earth is dramatic. A secret global culture leaving coded memories in myths is dramatic. But drama is not evidence. The mainstream picture is less tidy, yet it does not lack wonder. It shows ordinary human communities living through extraordinary planetary change, ice collapse, sea level rise, ecological upheaval, drowned coastlines, and new social experiments. The true story does not need a vanished super-civilization to be profound. It is profound because vulnerable, intelligent, observant people endured it without writing, and still some memory of water seems to echo through later human tradition. The flood that was not one flood may also explain why there is no single archaeological signature. If the ancient transformation consisted of many regional events, then the evidence should be scattered, uneven, and local. That is exactly what appears. Coral terraces record sea level rise. Submerged forest reveal drowned land. Sediment cores show changing salinity. Vegetation and flood layers. E-cores record climate instability. River deposits preserve violent flow. Archaeological sites show shifts in settlement and subsistence. None of these alone says here is the great flood together. They say something more subtle. The world changed by water and humans were there. By the time later, civilizations begin writing flood stories. The original post-Ice Age experiences, if they survive at all, have traveled through immense distances of memory. They have been reshaped by farmers, priests, kings, scribes, sailors, and storytellers. They have absorbed local disasters, moral lessons, cosmologies, and political meanings. Still, beneath the layers, one ancient recognition remains recognizable. Water can end a world and begin another around 11,600 years ago. That recognition was not metaphor. It was landscape. It was coastline. It was river, mud, ice, hunger, movement, and loss. The Great Flood was not a single wave crossing the planet. It was the long moment when humanity learned that even the map could die. The world after the waters is not a clean new beginning. It is a world of survivors carrying old maps inside their minds while walking across landscapes that no longer match hem. The sea has climbed over plains where people once moved. Rivers have carved new paths through soft post-glacial ground. Forests have spread into regions that once lay open beneath cold winds. Wetlands have appeared, vanished, and appeared again. Animals have shifted their ranges or disappeared from familiar territories. The ice has retreated, but it has not left quietly. It has left behind lakes, floods, exposed stone, raw soil, and coastlines that continue to move long after the first shock of warming has passed. Humanity enters the Holocene not as a species stepping into comfort, but as a species stepping into consequence. In the long view, this age becomes the foundation of the human world. We recognize warmer conditions, support new ecological patterns. Sea levels eventually approach something closer to modern coastlines, though local change continues. Communities in some regions grow more settled. Plants and animals are drawn slowly into domestication. Villages appear. Ritual centers rise. Storage, inheritance, territorial memory, and social obligation deepen. But from the human viewpoint, none of this is inevitable. No one living near the beginning of the Holocene knows that arming will spread, that cities will rise, or that later civilizations will look back and call their time prehistoric. They are not the prologue to history in their own minds. They are people solving immediate problems in a world that has become both generous and unstable. The legacy of the floods is partly geographical. The modern map hides the old one: the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf, parts of the North Sea, the edges of the Mediterranean, the drowned mouths of rivers, and countless continental shelves around the planet, concealed territories that may once have supported human movement and life. Some of these places were corridors, some were hunting grounds, some were coasts rich with fish and shellfish. Some may have held repeated camps, graves, meeting places, and stories that vanished without writing. What survives in the record suggests that ancient people adapted to the changing world, but adaptation left many losses unrecorded. The sea did not only take land, it took context. That missing context shapes archaeology even now, when researchers reconstruct human history from surviving sites. They work with a record tilted toward what endured: caves, dry shelters, stone tools, upland deposits, durable bones, and places lucky enough to avoid erosion. The drowned coast remains harder to read. Underwater archaeology is beginning to recover pieces, but only pieces. This means that the early Holocene may always appear more fragmented than it truly was. There may have been networks, seasonal patterns, and coastal traditions that would change the story if they could be seen clearly. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness should not be mistaken for emptiness. The legacy is also cultural. Flood stories in later civilizations do not need to descend from one single post-Ice Age event to carry ancient emotional truth. They may draw from many waters: rivers that drowned fields, seas that swallowed shores, storms that erased settlements, lakes that burst through natural dams, and inherited memories of lands no longer reachable. Over time, these experiences become sacred narratives, moral warnings, origin stories, and visions of renewal. A flood becomes the end of corruption, the beginning of a covenant, the washing clean of a world, or the punishment of a people who failed to listen. Beneath those later meanings may lie something older and simpler. A being remembering that water once crossed the boundaries of the known world. The legacy is also practical. After the waters, people learn to live more intensely with risk. Settled life brings new power, but also new vulnerability. A mobile group can move when conditions fail. A village must protect houses, stores, fields, graves, and social ties. Farming offers control, but it binds people to rainfall, rivers, soil, and seasons. The same water that makes grain grow can destroy the harvest. The same floodplain that feeds a community can bury it. From this ancient bargain will eventually come irrigation, canals, levees, drainage systems, calendars, flood myths, river gods, and the political power of those who claim to manage water. The first great civilizations will rise beside rivers, not because rivers are safe, but because they are dangerous and fertile at the same time. No single explanation fully accounts for why some human groups move towards settlement and agriculture, while others continue successful foraging lifeways. Climate matters, population matters, plants and animals matter, culture, ritual, memory, and chance matter too. The end of the Ice Age does not push all people down the same road. It opens and closes different roads in different places. Some communities remain mobile, because mobility is still the best answer. Some settle because local abundance allows it. Some cultivate plants gradually. Some resist or abandon farming. Human history, after the flood, is not a straight line from disaster to civilization. It is a braided river splitting and rejoining across landscapes changed by water. Yet the transformation around 11,600 years ago remains one of the great thresholds. Before it, humans live in a late glacial world of lower seas and colder patterns with vast lands exposed that are now lost. After it, they live in the Holocene world, where the climate background becomes more familiar to later history, even if never perfectly stable. Between those worlds lies a period of thaw, flood, hunger, movement, and invention. The old Ice Age map dies. The new human map begins to form. Not all at once, not everywhere, not by one cause, but through countless local choices made under pressure. The most haunting part is that many of the people who endured this turning point left no names. Their languages are gone, their coastlines are gone, their stories will survive, if at all, in altered echoes. A stone blade found far inland may be all that remains of a group whose grandparents once lived near a drowned shore. A layer of mud may be the only trace of a flood that changed a valley's memory. A myth written thousands of years later may preserve only the faint outline of an older fear. What survives in the record suggests resilience, but resilience should not be confused with an absence of loss. The world after the waters is therefore the beginning of something and the burial of something else. It is the age when humans begin to hold certain places more tightly even after seeing places vanish. It is the age when memory becomes more necessary because the land itself has proved unstable. It is the age when water teaches a lesson that later civilizations will never fully forget. The world beneath human life is powerful, changeable, and never completely owned. The flood that was not one flood leaves behind no single ark, no single drowned city, no single date that explains everything. It leaves behind a changed planet, a missing map, and a human species forced to build its future on ground that had already taught it how easily ground can disappear. And then the long noise of water fades, not because the water is gone, but because people learn to live with its new shape. The shore becomes ordinary again. Children are born who never saw the old plain. Rivers that once seemed strange become familiar. Forest paths replace open tracks. The stories remain, but they soften at the edges. A place that was once remembered as a real camp becomes a lost homeland. Then a warning, then a sacred image, then perhaps only a line in a myth whose first speaker is forgotten. This is how deep time works on human memory. It does not erase everything at once. It wears details away and leaves shapes behind. A flood becomes a beginning. A disappearance becomes a lesson. A migration becomes an origin. The people who lived through the end of the Ice Age did not know they were standing at the doorway of the Holine, but they carried humanity through it all the same. They watched the water rise, followed animals into new ranges, gathered unfamiliar foods, rebuilt camps, buried their dead, taught their children, and kept walking. Somewhere beneath the sea, there are still old river valleys filled with darkness and silt. Somewhere below the waves, roots of ancient trees remain locked in drowned soil. Somewhere under mud, a tool may lie where a hand dropped it before the shoreline moved away forever. These things do not speak loudly, they wait. And when they are found, they remind us that history is not only what was written, not only what was built in stone, and not only what survived above the waterline. The Great Flood 11,600 years ago was not one wave swallowing the world. It was the world changing its boundaries again and again until human life had to change with it. It was ice becoming river, river becoming sea, coast becoming memory, memory becoming myth. And in that slow, immense transformation, humanity learned one of its oldest truths: survival is not the same as permanence. The waters pass, the stories remain, and beneath the quiet surface of the modern world, the drowned landscapes of our beginning are still there, holding their breath in the dark.